My name is Jan Servaas. I'm the director of the SBS Center Communication for Sustainable Social Change at the University of Massachusetts here in Amherst. And my guest today is Professor Tim Kennedy from the University of Tampa in Florida. The reason why Tim is with us is that he is the author of a book which recently got published. The title of the book being Where the Rivers Meet the Sky, and that refers to a project he has been involved in for quite some time, the so-called Sky River Project, and I am sure that he will explain what that stands for. But the book itself and the work Tim has been doing with native Alaskans over the past 20, if not more years, is important and has been endorsed by many people, not only the people he worked with, but also names like William Foote White, who is in our social scientific field referred to as the father of the participatory observation techniques. He is also the author of one of the very famous classics, which is still being used in many sociology and anthropology courses, the Street Corner Society, written and published in the 40s, so many years ago. But even for today's standards, more important, President Barack Obama, when he received a copy of the book, wrote, "I greatly appreciate Professor Kennedy's background and work. I noted Professor Kennedy's assessment of the importance of human factors in effective social mobilization, drawn from his field experience in native Alaskan villages." So without much more introduction, because that would lead us too far, and I'm sure you will refer to some of it in your answers, I guess. How come that a Catholic Irish boy from Syracuse, New York, ends up with the native Alaskans sometime in the 60s?
Well, that's a good question, because if I was given 10 choices of where I would want to go when I decided to join the Domestic Peace Corps, which was Volunteers in Service to America, and
the VISTA, right?
It's called the VISTA program.
Yeah.
And I didn't have a college education or anything, so I didn't think the Peace Corps would accept me. And I had a girlfriend, and we were getting more serious and talking about getting married or whatever. So we thought that it would be a good way to start our marriage would be to be thinking outward instead of just being selfish. And it was of that era. Mm-hmm. I was actually a part of that era that actually was inspired by John F. Kennedy's statement about ask not what you can do, what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That actually meant a lot to me. And even though I was a working class person and everything, it never entered my mind that I couldn't do certain things. Mm-hmm. I guess that's one thing that's interesting about this country, I guess. But we looked at all the different programs, and they had radio programs on promoting VISTA, and they had really cool people like Miles Davis, people like that saying, you got to care enough to really get involved and things. So they gave us 3 choices of where we would go in the world in the program. Mm-hmm. And so we saw American Samoa was our first choice. Our second choice was Puerto Rico. Our third choice was the U.S. Virgin Islands. And we had to time it so that we left for VISTA training the same week that we got married in New York City, because we didn't have any money. And I got a telegram welcoming me to the University of Alaska training program for the 3rd program of VISTA volunteers. Mm-hmm. So it never entered my mind. That would have been my 40th choice if I had 10 choices.
So, but it happened to be not only the choice, but the place you ended up in.
Yeah, so it wasn't anything I ever thought about. I didn't have really that much information or knowledge about the cultures in Alaska, except for a touristy kind of images of village Eskimos or people with harpoons and going out hunting whales.
And it was less exotic and warm than the places you wanted to go to.
And so when we did get there, the training was kind of geared towards advocacy. That we were, just the fact that we lived there and shared this extreme poverty, that when we became decision makers later on in our lives, that we would be very sensitive to the needs of people, poor people.
For them or for the environment you would
whatever you
face
would end up,
afterwards?
you would be that much more sensitive. And so I just thought that was incredibly arrogant, just again, without any real intellectual response to it. I just at a gut level, I thought, my God, I'm just going to live there for a year or 2 years just so I can just soak in whatever poverty in real time that they were experiencing. So I guess right from the very beginning, I didn't really fully understand exactly what they wanted us to do. But they just said, you're just going to tell people you just live there if they ask you what you're there for.
So you were not given an assignment,
No, they even told
skills.
us that the main problem was alcoholism, suicide, things like this, and that went off the charts statistically, was because of boredom. They actually said that that was the main reason for all the problems in the villages. And so they gave us a softball, a baseball bat, and a Coleman stove, because they also said that they needed to boil their water, that they had huge problems with diarrhea was the #1 killer of babies, and they had a horrible impetigo problems, just terrible. And so we went into this training village, an Athabascan Indian village, with a Coleman stove, a softball, and a baseball bat. I put that in, I couldn't resist it, I had to put that in the book. And the chief met us at the airstrip, and he had just come back from Montana. He was a firefighter, like a professional firefighter. His name was Ken Albert, Chief Ken Albert. And he found out we were from the New York area, and so he asked us what we thought of who was the mayor of New York City at the time, Mayor John Lindsay. And then before I answered him, he said, I think he's imitating the Kennedys too much with this touch football and all this kind of stuff. And of course, Lindsay was a Republican, liberal Republican. So that was a total shock to me that even, then he said, I read Life magazine.
Right.
Okay? And then he had another man drive us in a pickup to the village, it was near the Alaska highway and the Canadian border. And we had a little log cabin that they were putting us in. And then the man that drove us said, oh, by the way, boil your water. So that wiped out the Coleman stove. We were told to keep our door open when we boiled the water so that these primitive people could see somebody boiling water. And we were to be a role model.
Set the example, yeah.
Yeah. And when we were there, it was really shocking because the Bureau of Indian Affairs teachers did not have any school at all. They had what they call recreation. None of these Athabascan children were getting any formal education at all from the Bureau of Indian Affairs teachers. And yet they had a Federal Aviation Administration site at the airstrip, and they had Alaska state schools for their kids. They were all Caucasian. And I just got involved with some of the horrible stories that we were hearing about, because people would not talk to us at all. They would pull like a curtain when we'd walk by their house, so you could hear the latch going on their doors.
So you were outsiders.
Yes, we were definitely out. They didn't know who we were or anything. And then we found out that a very revered, a beloved chief, an elderly man, froze to death because there was a place for big game hunters, for mainly bear hunters, and they had a bar there. And he was, hooked on the booze. And they also had women from the village there, and they used to kind of rent them out to big game hunters for sex. It was really amazing. And but anyway, the worst part of it was this chief died, and then the FAA personnel found the body, the frozen corpse, and they used it as a joke in the compound, putting it in people's closets. They'd open it up, and a frozen Indian would fall out of it. They even broke his bones, and so he could sit on a couch. Like he'd come home and there's a back of somebody's head, and it's a dead Indian.
Didn't they have any cultural sensitivity?
Well, I guess not. And then a number of other things happened, but a little boy was killed when we were there. His uncle drove over him in a truck as they had walked out of the house because his mother was sleeping out over a drunk. She was one of the women that hung around the bar. And it was just horrific what happened after that, because the person that was doing this to them was also in charge of the air charter service that they needed to put the boy on to save his life to go to the hospital. So the guy had that kind of control over them. And I had never seen anything like that before at all.
So you were dropped in a strange environment.
Yeah.
You observed obviously horrible things, but you were not really appreciated by the locals. So how did you gradually establish some kind of rapport?
Well, what happened was that it was actually the death of the boy. But halfway through, what they did is they called a magistrate down from a regional center, and this Alaska State policeman was invited. They've been filing complaints about this man that controlled them, their lives, for 2 years. They thought they had enough against him that they could act on it, which was a very courageous thing to do. But in the meantime, the boy, he was saving the boy's life, bringing him to the hospital, they thought, while they're trying to put him in jail. And so anyway, about halfway through the meeting, somebody came in, they whispered to Chief Ken Albert, and the boy died. And then they just started wailing. I mean, it was just like it was coming from the tips of their toes all the way through their bodies, just yelling and crying and falling on the floor and everything. And it was kind of like the last straw of what they were dealing with and stuff. But the fact that I had stood, I did what you're not supposed to do. You're not supposed to, the trooper had never filed any of the complaints with the magistrate. So she knew nothing about the 2 years of complaints. And so you could see that all the courage just went right out of them, oozed right out of them. And then they had the death of the boy announced right at that time. And so...
So there was no paper trail about all of this?
Oh, no, none at all. And so then the trooper said, look, I have in Alaska, rural Alaska, I have the authority to decide whether something warrants going on to the next step. But of course, he's supposed to tell the people who are making the complaint, but he never did that. And then he said, well, I have a bunch of villages I have to go to. I don't have much time. So of course, I had just finished tending bar in a local neighborhood working class bar. So I just spewed forth out of my mouth. I said, what are you chasing, Sodom McMoose? Which was the great quote of the time, which came back to haunt me in Vista training. They tried to throw me out of Vista for saying that, and not even allowing me to stay to the year, saying I was too immature. But I just came out, you know, and so the people in the village couldn't believe I said that. And they immediately came to our house, said, you know, you need firewood, you need this, you need that. And then they wrote a letter requesting that we stay for a year. That was the big breakthrough. My big mouth got me.
So just one outburst just triggered it.
It was so genuine, you know, so spontaneous. And then they had this incredible potlatch where all the chiefs from the interior came. And then they had still the traditional religion where they give something that was special in the person's life and they put it on top of the grave. Then they put a spirit house over it, which is now made out of plywood and visqueen windows, but it used to be birch bark, so that the soul would be happy in the transition from life to death. I mean, in that transition period. It would not stay to haunt the village or to curse the village. And so they were trying to figure out what this 3-year-old boy who was just killed really liked a lot. So it was the most poignant thing I'd ever seen. All the chiefs gathered and they stayed up all night long interviewing 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds who would sleep and then they'd wake them up and bring them in. What did this boy really care about? And so I didn't know what they arrived at, but the next morning they had something in a paper bag and they asked me to help carry the spirit house, which was a real honor. And anyway, when they put the body in the casket and everything, and I'd never seen an unembalmed body before. He just looked like he was asleep. He had rosy cheeks and everything, a beautiful little kid. And then they put all the tundra over him, and then they took something out of the bag. All the chiefs carried it over and put it on the grave. It was a 6-pack of Pepsi Cola. And then they had another discussion after they put the Pepsi on top of the grave, because that's what the kid said he liked more than anything else, Pepsi. And then I guess somebody decided all they needed was the symbol of the Pepsi cans. Why waste 6 cans of Pepsi? So they passed the Pepsi around and 6 chiefs drank the Pepsi. And then they put it back in exactly like it was a brand new 6 cans of Pepsi. But it was the most incredible thing I'd ever seen. And then his father was a drunk who lived away from the village and never saw the kid. They would not allow him to participate in the funeral. But when they all left on this hill, and you could see the Alaska Range in the background, it was very dramatic, he was allowed to come to the grave. And I stayed back a little bit, and he had the dry heaves. I mean, he was trying to show emotion, but there was nothing there, and it was just the most pathetic thing I'd ever seen. And now I had been in Alaska 3 weeks. And then I also had a guy knock on my door that night asking forgiveness. He was real drunk. and you know, these are uninhibited drunks, you know, kind of. And my wife was afraid, you know, and so I opened the door, and he goes, "Please forgive me, please forgive me." And I couldn't figure out why, but all I knew to do to get rid of the guy, I went, "In nomine Patris et Filios et Spiritus Sanctus." So like, I used to be an altar boy, right? And it worked. And he went, "Hallelujah, hallelujah." And he just started, I could hear him going away from my house yelling hallelujahs. Okay, the next day I'm at the potlatch after the boy was buried, and they had moose head soup, which they have to free the soul. That's part of their religious belief. He had shot the moose out of season and broken the white man's laws, but was doing the proper thing as an Athabascan, traditional Athabascan. So he thought I was the preacher coming to do the funeral. Just some white guy was in this log cabin. So he was asking the preacher's forgiveness for shooting the moose out of season and breaking the law, even though he was the hero, because you have to have moose head soup to free the soul.
So they in fact interpreted it as you were someone sent from heaven to assist them and to cure them, so to speak. But in your book you also indicate that that was not the kind of role you wanted to play, and you gradually learned to adjust in other ways. Can you give us a bit of an overview of the different roles you think you normally can perform in these kind of situations, and what, from your perspective and experience, the best role would be?
Well, it's interesting because in the last 30 years or so, the rhetoric has really changed when it comes to social action. People have learned the rhetoric of facilitation, collaboration, et cetera, but when push comes to shove, when people actually act, they act as advocates. Okay? They see themselves as, you know, these are well-intended, caring people, but who walk around with this attitude that they know more than the people that they're assisting, or they wouldn't be asked in to help them or whatever, you know, especially if you're labeled an expert or anything like that. And that, let's say, you know how decisions are made maybe better than they do, or you speak English better than they do in the U.S. context or whatever. And so you may not even be thinking about building any kind of insidious dependency on your acting on their behalf, but because people are very thrilled and excited that you care enough, you know, you're living with them, you're trying to learn their language, you're, you know, et cetera.
It's also exotic for them to have that kind of outside.
Yeah, and to have somebody pay attention to them that they know, or maybe they've attached more importance to you than who you really are or whatever. But it doesn't take long, or let's say something good does happen, some change does happen or whatever, then they've got Tim Kennedy to thank. They don't have themselves to thank. And then if they have another problem, they have to go to Tim Kennedy or some equivalent. There's no legacy of any kind of effective action on their part that, you know, so the spotlight is on your caring, your skills, whatever, rather than being the spotlight being on their potential or what skills they have, what leadership they've already demonstrated. I mean, when I went up, they'd lived there 12,000 years in the world's worst climate. The focus is all on the caring advocate. And if good things happen, you thank the advocate. And then if things don't turn out, you've got the perfect government officials or decision makers to blame for their apathy or their racism or their fascist or whatever. We had, you know, we used to throw that word fascist around like crazy in the 60s. And so you never really deal with your own actions or your own behavior. And so I started to question that little by little, even though I acted it out on a regular basis for the first 6 months or so that I was in. They wouldn't send us back to the Athabascan village, the training village. We were sent for a year, a minimum of a year, up to an Arctic caribou hunting village, up in the northwest Arctic, above the Arctic Circle. Excuse me. And so little by little, I started, I mean, because I was taking the time, I was finding out who the leaders were. And each of the, you know, I saw the extended families were the their power units. They would sacrifice community needs to strengthen their family, because they were brought there artificially by the U.S. government and a fundamentalist church in 1915. And they had never really thought beyond their own families where they were brought from. So there was no community level discussions hardly at all.
It was also difficult given the distance, I guess.
And then plus the distance and everything else. But what I did, my first act of breaking that bond with advocacy even though I had all the rhetoric and everything of helping people help themselves and all that kind of stuff, I didn't know how to implement it. But little by little, I started making a break from it, and my first big move, I guess, away from it was the head of the Job Corps in Alaska, one of the War on Poverty programs. Came there, very soft-spoken, very nice man. And I'd already talked to the people in the village. I said, when government officials come in here, do they come in, how do you prepare for that? They said, oh, they come in unannounced. We never know when they're coming. They might tell the teachers or the missionary, but we never know about it.
That was a spy on you.
Yeah, that was a shock to me. But anyway, this Job Corps man had announced, he had asked permission to come. So I knew he could be my first good candidate. And so anyway, I said to him, look, I'm going to try to break the cycle of you coming to me and then I'm telling you what the people here feel or what they think about different issues. But I know who the leaders are, and they've agreed to meet with you in their homes. And there was actually a non-fraternization policy with government officials not to enter a native villager's home, okay, which I thought was a shock, but I saw the field manual for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and it's actually stated in there, a non-fraternization policy.
So you need an intermediary like yourself to
everything was based on advocacy.
Right.
And they would rely on the advocates, teachers, missionaries, then VISTA volunteers come in. Okay? And so anyway, I took him to meet the, who I knew was a very well-respected man. His English name was Walter Morris. They all had Christian surnames or English surnames so they could get welfare. The federal government would not recognize our Eskimo names or their Nupiaq names. And so I took him to see Walter, and then I left, introduced him and left. He came back to my house about 2 hours later. He was walking 3 inches above the ground. He was so excited. And he thanked me profusely. He said, I've never been in a home before, and, a native villager's home. And so he said he's volunteered to drive me to the next village tomorrow, and I'm going to put me in a sled, and he's going to take me up in a snowmobile. So I helped him, I sort of tucked him in the sled the next morning, and he took off with a big smile. And then when my local villager friend came back from the other village, I said, well, what'd you think? And he goes, this is a direct quote. He went, I think I made him happy. That was his only statement. And so both of them were very happy for the experience. And then
because
I just
they could
built
share
on that.
experiences.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And he was shown respect he had never been shown before, with this government official actually coming into his home on his, basically making himself vulnerable. That became a word I started using in my vocabulary. None of us ever makes ourselves vulnerable to these people. And so we're not pitying them like maybe they've been pitied in the past. We're making a better connection to them, but it's based on sympathy, not empathy. And I started becoming almost obsessing with the difference between sympathy and empathy.
Can you elaborate?
Well, for instance, we're allowed to give sympathy cards if somebody dies. Okay, we're not expected to be empathetic and to make ourselves more vulnerable than what a sympathetic response can be. But the sympathetic person goes beyond the pitying person because you think there is potential for change, and you are willing to make a connection with them. You make a human connection to them, but it's on your terms. Okay.
You're in control.
Academics go in the summer semester, when the summer break, they go between semesters. They don't even know what the rhythm of the community might be, or take the time to find that out. In Alaska, it's from January to April is when you visit. All the government officials and the researchers go up there in the summer, when people are out in fish camp and canneries, and and people don't show up for their meetings, and they label them as apathetic,
right?
Because they're getting involved with them on their terms. But the empathetic person, even though you can't really fully understand what another human being feels, particularly from another culture or whatever, you can at least vicariously put yourself in a position to be more vulnerable to them and have your involvement with them more on their terms than on your terms. Okay? You don't completely give up any kind of sense of yourself, but but the key thing there is people are sensing that you are willing to show them that kind of respect. And that cannot be spoken with words. It has to be acted out, that kind of respect.
Non-verbally.
Yeah. And so that's where when I start writing about pity, sympathy, and empathy, then I connect them to the roles of the social broker, the social advocate, okay? And then I've gone through 5 different names for the role that I've tried to develop. I was first called a catalytic agent. You've heard that term probably many times. And you're a catalyst for social change. And then I went to Cornell, and the chairman of my committee, my PhD committee, Milton Barnett, said, you can't use that term anymore. I said, what do you mean? He said, that comes from the third agent in the chemical change process. And the catalytic agent remains unchanged. And look at how profoundly changed you've been by your experience. Get rid of that term. So I could never use it again.
So what came next?
Well, then enabler came next. Yeah. And then, of course, AA and Narcotics Anonymous used that for people that enable their partners and stuff. So I had to get rid of that. And then I go to Quebec, in Montreal. I'm the head of the Challenge for Change studio at the National Film Board of Canada. I went right out of an Eskimo village to that, without a bachelor's degree or anything, or those kind of credentials. And everybody's coming up to me afterwards with great emotion going, animation sociale.
Yes.
You're a social animator, which doesn't work in English. It works in French, but it does not work in English. Immediately you think of Bugs Bunny or Mickey Mouse. So I had to get rid of that when I moved back to the States. It worked great in Quebec, but then facilitator reared up. And then just that was used by everybody. And people said, you should write a book, facilitation, my approach and stuff. But then it just got so overused. And it doesn't imply action. To me, it was just very limp. It didn't have any energy or dynamism behind it.
You have a point there.
And so, but anyway, when I got the opportunity to publish the book, the publisher, who we know very well, Chin Seik Yoon, that's what he wanted me to use initially, is to use facilitator. But the thing that I love about Chin is he was very respectful of me, because I was invited to a conference paid for by the Canadian Donner Foundation. It was a 14-day conference in St. John's, Newfoundland, at Memorial University. And Don Snowden, who got me the money to do my Sky River thing in Alaska, who was responsible for the Fogo Island project, which is very famous.
Don Snowden and his reputation on the Fogo Island, he used more or less the same kind of technique or approach as you used.
Right. And the first week it was all of the masters of language, and they had great names like Wired World from Kitchener, Ontario, and things like that. And what it was a conference for all the people who were trying to move beyond advocacy and using these tools of video and film from all over the world. And at the end of the conference, well, after the second week, it was all the people who were doing show and tell. This is what we're doing. Then the whole power thing shifted. But at the end of the conference, people said, what do we call ourselves? We're not advocates, we're not brokers, this type of thing. And then a man from Ireland, his name was Paddy Gardner. He was working with the Department of Communication in Ottawa. He said, I call myself a mobilizer of other people's competencies. And I wrote it down like a little kid. I just thought that was wonderful.
And that's what you kept in the book.
Right, and so I said to Chin, I've had a term since 1972 that I would love to use, social mobilizer. Because first of all, if you're talking about mobilizing other people's competencies, it implies very clearly that you think they are competent,
right,
that they do have skills, they do whatever it might be. So I just love that. And Chin said, fine. And then we Googled it, and we started seeing it popping up in Asia as a term that is being used now. But I coveted that term for 20-some years, longer than that even.
Yeah, it's still being debated which is the right term, but I tend to agree that mobilizer is a very good one.
So there is no perfect term. I haven't come up with a perfect term yet.
But may I move on a bit, because after all, you used a specific kind of communication tool to establish this kind of rapport and act as a social mobilizer. In those days, we were not yet ready for video, but we had film. Can you briefly elaborate on that and probably also give us an example of the ones you used in those days?
Well, actually, I used video before I filmed. When Don Snowden got me the money to do my experiment, he demanded that I have 16mm film. And then Colin Lowe, who he brought to Alaska, that did the Fogo Island project, was a filmmaker from the National Film Board. But I first got involved with portable video. It was called half-inch video. But my boss wanted to buy a studio setup made by Ampex that the owner of the company kept saying was portable. And I got involved with a crazy experience, which I write about in the book. which made me question the whole social documentary or expose documentary approach. There's probably the most violent street in North America in Anchorage, and then Fairbanks has an equivalent. In terms of the murder rate, the rapes, it's just brutal. A mix of peoples. You had an Army and an Air Force base, you had construction workers, you had black pimps from California with African-American huge prostitution rings there. You had Native Alaskans coming in and out of the canneries, construction workers coming in off of the oil rigs and stuff. So it was a very violent place. And my boss wanted to do an expose of it, and he wanted to shove this street down these bleeding heart liberals in the federal government kind of a thing, which of course was not my style at all, but he assigned me to do that. Mm-hmm. And so the man came in with this big, huge studio deck that he put on a big, huge studio tripod, had a big, huge, like an arc light on the front of it, and then I just had tons of cable. Nobody had ever seen a camera like that before. And to the bartenders in these very rough bars, and say, can I plug this in and we can shoot, and so they just said, sure. And the first bar we went into, a guy ran right off of his stool and tried to punch the light out. And I'm trying to get him to back out, and we're stumbling over our own cable and things like that. We go back out in the street again. And then some white GIs from the Army base started encouraging the guy to punch the light out. And then a bunch of black GIs came by and were encouraging us to keep going with what we were doing. So they started yelling at each other. They were on both sides of the camera.
It was fun for everybody.
Yeah, it was just a classic scenario, right? And then, of course, I'm trying to be a broadcaster, right? I didn't know any better. So I had this Helly Hansen rain gear on, and I had like the rain hat, and I had the microphone. And so at my best broadcast quality voice, my only comment was, I think a race riot is about to erupt here on 4th Avenue in Anchorage, Alaska. And then he's saying, great, and the cameraman's going, great, we got this, right? But anyway, just one thing after another. We went in one place, and the guy took a cue stick around the other hand, hit another guy in the face with it, cracked his face open, which just one bloody thing after another we shot. And then, thank God, the guy that was going to edit it really screwed up, and he took out everything that he misunderstood what was going on. He didn't understand A roll, B roll, or anything like that. And he got rid of all of the meat and just kept all the cutaways in this Ampex dealer's place. So I thought that was divine intervention. I just felt so relieved.
But so you could move on with some
I said,
other
gee, I'll
things.
never ever do this again to anybody, because it turned out the guy trying to punch the light out, he was a federal judge in there with a prostitute. So he had very good reason not to want to be on camera. But anyway, I then talked my boss into getting a small portable, the first Sony Video Rover. And then I eventually moved on to the Community Enterprise Development Corporation, helping the villagers set up fish marketing co-ops. And then my boss, he allowed me to buy a small camera too. And that's how I started out, just as almost using it as a toy.
You have documentation of that, right?
Well, I did, but then with video, I didn't have much money or anything. I just kept redoing the video, erasing everything and redoing it. I would love to have all of that original footage. But then when it came time to actually seriously consider doing this experiment in a village at the mouth of the Yukon River, where I was working with them on the co-op, they agreed to try using these tools or whatever. I had them think it over for a while. And then I got $200,000 through Don Snowden's connection in Washington, D.C. I took it out of a PR budget, out of the War on Poverty. But I didn't even write a grant for it. And then, so then I had the opportunity to working with people with both small format video and 16 millimeter sync sound film. So I have a chapter comparing the two on it.
Can you summarize that?
Because it was a huge difference. I mean, when people, first of all, the video was very unintimidating. People felt very comfortable with it. These are oral tradition storytelling people. And then when they would talk about it later on in the pool hall or whatever, they were constantly talking about how they appeared to themselves.
Right.
It was a very internalized kind of experience.
But it was inward looking.
Very inward looking. And then, but then when the issues got established on video, people reacting strongly to their neighbors' comments on video, and then arriving at consensus on what an issue was, then I had them pick someone who would express the village position on film. Okay? And so that was a wonderful way to find out who their opinion leaders were. And they took it very seriously. And like the biggest issue that we dealt with, that they were having to send their 11-year-old boys and girls to Chillicothe Indian School in Oklahoma or Shamawa in Salem, Oregon, to get a white man's high school education, which they were all motivated to do, because even to be a laborer there, you had to have a high school diploma. The film then had a completely different impact, because people would talk about, they became aware, they were savvy enough because they saw a lot of films, old World War II films and stuff, that this was more important in some ways, and there's a lot more involved in it technologically, and there's a 3-man film crew they're controlling, and that it's going to go to Alpha Cine Labs in Seattle, and then take a while to come back, that other people beyond the village could be seeing them. So that whole feeling that I'm representing the village and it's going to be seen in a state capital started to become real to them.
So the power of the technology.
Yes, it was very, very different. But what I love about the digital era now is that you can get a lot of the power of film and the projection versus something coming off of a screen with electronic scans, with video now, with even these small little mini cams and stuff. So it's a great era for these technologies that are much less expensive, and you don't need the processing that you need with film and everything. But the thing I also liked about film as a community development field worker is that the pressure, if you have an instant video image, you got a great interview or something, is to want to use it instantaneously, get it as quickly as possible to the leadership, decision makers, even if the village community development process is not ready to act beyond the village yet, or to take the next step yet. Okay? So
it is using film as an instrument for a larger process.
Yes. And then I reintroduced the small format video again when the government officials were given the same respect, the same editing rights as the villagers, which they were totally shocked by. They, is this for real? Or they didn't know how to trust it at first. But when they saw through my actions that I really meant it, that I was trying to get an exchange between people who do not have a horizontal exchange or anything close to a horizontal exchange, and all they do is go to these fancy little meetings, and the villagers do some Inupiaq drum dance, and they give them a little muck tuck or something. And of course, they don't know what's really going on, if they're sensitive at all to that. And so then they could then check with their field staff before they responded on video. I gave them all the same editing rights. They even could bring their attorneys in, which they did a number of times. But then a lot of times they actually accompanied the video or went back out to the village immediately. But that was the key to the respect in the state capitol, is I gave them exactly the same rights as the citizens. So you allowed the responsible government officials, and there were many of them, the proper forum and respect, and then you let the bad guys indict themselves through their own editing decisions. Because the one thing that nobody ever believes when I say it is that they never edited out the racist statements that they made, or the racism that would ooze out of them having to deal with these primitives and live in these villages.
Although they discussed it.
Yeah, I mean, and they would show it to their field staff. They would approve it. And they could never accuse me of editing them out of context, like a journalist or a broadcaster. And so that was a very important part of the process.
So if you would have to select one or a few examples of your productions over there, or the project you were involved in, what would you suggest for us to watch? Well,
the biggest change that I made was not helping people solve human problems by making them dwell on them, or making them dwell on the problem that was my priority. Like the Dick and Jane Reader with 6-year-old Inupiaq children in the Arctic when I went up there. I was appalled. And then I went into the regional capital talking to the Indian Affairs administrator about it, and I realized very quickly that this was my agenda. Because he said to me, I've been here 18 years. I've never heard an Inupiaq or an Athabascan parent ever complain about this reader. And you're going to be here for a couple of years, and you're not my constituency. So I gave him the perfect out. He didn't have to deal directly with his constituents, the village parents and stuff. So anyway, little by little, years later, when I had the opportunity to do this Sky River process in the Lower Yukon River, smaller issues got dealt with initially. It's almost textbook kind of stuff, and they got a little bit of success doing that. They built their self-confidence, but it eventually led to this overwhelming emotional issue of having to send these little boys and girls who were the first 8th grade graduates to go all the way to Oklahoma to the dregs of the Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding school system. There were over 85 nations there. And the Hopis and the Navajos are mortal enemies. That's why the Hopis live on top of those, those bluffs there. But the only thing the Hopi kids and the Navajo kids could agree on is they didn't like what they call schemos. And they used to beat the hell out of these kids. They were terrified. And they're thousands of miles away from home, in a totally different weather system, and they were treated almost like they were like in a minimum security prison kind of environment. So this was, what do you do if you're a parent at the mouth of the Yukon River in the Arctic? Well, it's pretty obvious. You suffer in silence. You get to what I call implosive rage. You don't feel any ability to change anything, so you vent your anger inward. And your only safe opponents are the people who look the most like you that reflect your weakness. Mm-hmm. Could be slapping your kid or pushing your wife or whatever it might be if you're a fisherman there. Or getting drunk and then beating the hell out of your cousin. Mm-hmm. I called it implosive rage because there was no hope for change. Okay? But here I was coming in, raising people's hopes for change. Okay? And then if that gets dashed, that's when they explode for the first time. And they're usually directed at the well-intended liberal who raised their hopes and dashed it if he's still around. And that's totally self-destructive. So my whole thing was, what's a constructive way to act beyond yourselves, okay, mm-hmm. and get beyond implosion? So anyway, this issue eventually got brought up. And then people reacted very strongly to it when they saw it on video. And mm-hmm. it was a real buzz in the village because they had never talked about it beyond their own families. Okay.
So you used the technique of film to open up the space for a discussion,
yes.
which eventually then led to a change process which was sustained by the villagers themselves.
Yes, they picked, in other words, they arrived at the issue using the response to the video, mm-hmm. like that, and then they picked a person from the village, okay, to represent that position. And his name was William Trader. He would never be on a village council. He did not really speak English that well, but then he was approached and he agreed to take that responsibility. But then another key part of the thing where this is not journalism or whatever, is that I didn't prepare really good questions to bring him out or whatever. His job was to state as articulately as possible what his position was about what the problem was, but also to offer a solution, which I was not even involved with. I had no idea what he was going to say.
You just facilitated the opportunity.
Yeah, and then he chooses who he's going to talk to. Because one thing we noticed that people felt more comfortable talking to a person rather than looking into a camera. So we got rid of that looking into the camera real quickly. And so this was one of the very first interviews on the actual film crew. And so he asked me if I would do it with him. So then all I did with him was find out what he wanted to say, and I wrote down the main points. I asked no questions of my own, okay? And so, except if it was just like a follow-through a little bit on what he said he was trying to say. So the idea was to get as much focus as possible. And of course, these are storytellers, these are oral tradition people, so he didn't ramble, and he had time to think it over. So it was a very short amount of footage, fairly short, compared to what a filmmaker mm-hmm. would shoot. Like in a film board, we shot 20-to-1 on the frames. But anyway, he actually got through with he wanted to do it during a subsistence fishing break. He wanted to talk about mending his nets and fishing first. He set the whole interview up. And then I didn't even realize I was on camera. I had no experience at all with this at all. I had to learn the hard way. But then he finished the interview, and then he said to me, everybody, we pick up the gear and take off in the wheelbarrow. And I stay with him, and he goes, gee, I wish I had said about me worrying about my daughter getting killed in a plane crash or about me dying, and sometimes they won't even send them home for the funeral and stuff like that. And so I said, well, you want to say that now? So I ran like crazy and brought the film crew back, which they were all ticked off at and everything. But again, this was a very different approach to this. Right. Okay? And so he then added a very powerful closing to the film that was included in his thing. Right. But then after it goes to the lab, he then wanted to go with his wife, Martha, and then he reviews on a double system Siemens projector that I bought. So it's totally uncut footage and audio. And then we found out that they're so enamored of seeing themselves projected on a screen that important people were projected on, that you had to show it more than once, a number of times for him to start paying attention to what he was saying. We learned that the hard way. And so he said that he wanted certain things done. Other people rejected the whole film and wanted to do it over again, keeping their children outside of the house because they were making too much noise, things like that. So I could see they were embracing it as their statement.
Right.
And so then, anyway, that film was approved by the village. It started these incredibly emotional discussions about sending their children out. And the suicide rate was 155% above the national average. And we got that from Senator Robert Kennedy. And they were coming back in pine boxes. And so Legal Services Corporation had heard about the film. They asked to see it. They were just amazed by it. And so he was just talking about his daughter. He wasn't talking about native children or anything else, just talking about his daughter being sent away. And they sent a young lawyer out to the village. They agreed to file a class action suit on behalf of all Native Alaskan villagers. And then a friend of mine asked if she could take the film to the Harvard Law School. She showed it to the Harvard Law School faculty, and she told me that when the lights turned on, they were all crying. And then they assigned 2 Reginald Fellows to the Alaska Legal Services Corporation for as long as it took for the class action suit that became known as the Hooch case, because the first child named in the case was Molly Hooch. It's a very famous case in legal services. So advocates had a role here, but in a very, very different way.
Yeah.
You know? And so it's not getting rid of advocacy in that regard. But
Okay,
anyway,
can we take a moment to watch this fragment?
Do you think that Martina learned much about the Eskimo ways at high school she attends now?
Well, when I see that she's not learning in Eskimo ways, that means she forgot her completely homework and how to bake bread and how to help mom in the house and so on. Every time we want her to do is to tell her what to do, and just like a 5-6-year-old kid. And before she went out to Rankle, she never used to be told to do homework. And we found out that she changed her way of her doing things when she came back from school. So that's why I say not Eskimo ways. That's what I mean. She only learned how to read and talk English and do her arithmetic, all that sort of what she used to do in school. But not much of help to the housework. She forgot completely everything on housework. So if we are at high school here, and if she learned in both ways, homework and school, that would be really good for everybody, not only for her. So if we have the original school here, it would be really good for this whole village. Not only to this village, maybe to the other closer village too. And every weekend, if there's any high school kids from Alaknak or Catholic to here, maybe they could go home for a weekend and come back on Sunday evening. That would be much better too for the other closer villages too. I don't like to see Martina leave from here for school in winter time. One reason is, now suppose for instance, if I happen to die suddenly or heart attack or something, and she heard about me in school, and she rushed home if they ever sent her home. I don't know how she's going to feel if she saw me lying down covered with white sheet, and she can't ask me no questions or didn't know anything about what happened. But if she really was here with me all the time, and she knows from the time I was going to die, she would feel much more better, I think. And another thing, I don't like to have her happen to her on her way to school in winter time. Now suppose if she crashed with a plane, and that'll be the end of her life, and I'll never see her again.
Now that we have seen also one of the examples in the whole history of this particular village and the project, what would you consider to be the relevance of all of this? Because after all, it happened some time ago. Although you have stayed in touch with them, you are still on very good speaking terms with them. I understand. But what's the relevance of this particular case for all of us, and in a way, is this repeatable? Can we apply this for other contexts?
Well, I mean, the thing that's interesting to me, and how I tried to end the book with this statement about that this is not a formula that can be memorized and just transported. You have to have at least some basic belief in some kind of representative government, or the idea of the public service or public servant, so that you can approach them, or that's part of the process, that people anticipating that. But I just have been told many, many times, including current examples with the Aborigines and other groups that have implemented this process in their own interpretation of it. And so that's what I think is its strength, is that people can adapt it to their own pace, their own issues, their own urban or rural situation.
And that has already happened, right?
Oh yeah, and I'm finding out more and more now how many I even met Kian Tomaselli from University of Natal and University of Amsterdam one year. He ran up to me and went, my God, this is what my grassroots people are responding to and trying to implement. And I've gotten more and more of this, including even what the Aborigines started doing in 1995 with Tom Hogan.
Brazil, India, I noticed.
Yeah, the Kayapo in the Amazon, using this process, variation on it, without even knowing the name Sky River or me, about anything about me or anything. And just adapted it to their own situation.
But your starting statement is, it's not a formula.
Right, it's not a formula. And the other thing is that film that I just mentioned about this huge problem of the boarding schools, okay, led to a $149 million bond issue being approved by the urban population in Alaska to build over 200 high schools.
That's quite an achievement.
Yes, but that was put in perspective because people also did positive films. They even zeroed in on problems that they had in the past that they had resolved themselves without any outside help from anybody. And then also special events, cultural issues, the history of the lower Yukon, of the medicine men, the shaman, the Angatkuks, very powerful taboo subjects that became very, and they drew strength from that to deal with their problems, rather than just problem after problem after problem, or trying to manipulate the conversation to just talk about the problem that you want to help them with, whatever it might be, low-income housing, nutrition,
right.
Whatever. And so that was my big breakthrough, was moving beyond that problem-solving model.
Right, but people who are watching this, they might say, but isn't that visual anthropology? An anthropologist also tries to stay out of the heat and facilitate things without, as Food White would say, being the participant observer, but not going beyond that stage. Right. What's the difference?
Well, I complicated William Foot White's life, and he talked about that quite a bit because he wanted to move beyond being a participant observer. But the thing is, you're not objective at all. Your very presence is manipulation, just the fact that you're there. But the thing is that you're not building dependency. You know, that's the biggest thing that I was constantly, making sure that didn't happen. But visual anthropology, to me, is sort of studying the exotic other and trying to remain neutral and unbiased. My whole point was to help William Trader, when he was picked by the village, do the most articulate job he possibly could representing his position on what the problem was and what the solution could be. So I'm totally subjective in that regard. I'm just doing my best to act as, and I use the term amplifier rather than an interpreter. Because they were responding to their own video statements. I didn't have to ask leading questions to generate some energy where you've just set the agenda inadvertently without even wanting to do it. You may not even be aware that you've just set the agenda. They're trying to please you. You're the expert. you must think that must be important.
Right.
Like in Alaska, you know, they're building an oil pipeline. That would have been an obvious thing. What do you think about the oil companies raping rural Alaska? That would not have been one of their top 40 issues. Right. You know, but those are the things that I see. All kinds of people have really good instincts about this. So what I'm trying to do with that book is to share an experience and just order what people know intuitively. Just like I think you make a fabulous contribution with your research doing that, with your ability to articulate so many things that we all struggle with as field workers. But I've just been amazed at how much impact that this has had. Like when I published that article through the National Film Board of Canada, that's what Tom Hogan read in Australia, that the Aborigine. That was 1973. I had no idea of the impact of that. They had 26,000 subscribers, mainly in the developing world. So I'm just learning now in a lot of ways. And again, we mentioned last night about how many years it took me to get the book published.
Right.
I could not get an American publisher.
Because you don't fit the mold.
Did not fit. They couldn't figure out what box to put me in at all. And then they kept saying that I was challenging something they're very proud of, which is the whole idea of intervention. They call it third-party intervention at Cornell. And then I just had to be honest about it. I emailed the publisher in Boulder, Colorado, and said, that's exactly what I'm doing. Okay? But again, I see so many people that come to me in my presentations, and they're using all the right rhetoric, but then when I actually sit down and see what they're doing, it's classic advocacy.
I think that that's the good way to conclude this interview and this talk. We should go beyond advocacy, and that's what your book is about. Thanks, Professor Kennedy.
Thank you.
And thank you for your attention.
One thing I'd like to say is that this co-op has a lot of meaning in the long run, you know. The reason why I say that is it's the people that are building it. In the past, these people here that are working in the co-op now have been building up these other companies. Now that they're working for themselves, they're going to build this co-op with their own hands. And they know that what they're building is going to stay together because these people that are working are together. It's not a shaky thing. And if you're working for another company that's privately owned, you don't know from day to day what's going to happen tomorrow. Well, here, they know what's going to happen tomorrow because they're the ones that are making it, and they're the ones that are planning it. And there's no other way you can look at it. Without the people there, this co-op wouldn't have gotten this far. And it makes me feel good to see these people doing that because they're my people. And in some cases where you talk to a government agency or some other agency, they say the Eskimo. Well, who is the Eskimo? Well, I'm an Eskimo. You know, I know who I am. And if we can put this thing together, we'll make this thing work, and we'll be good competition to the other companies. There's no other way that we can do it. If we're going to fall off and get behind and not try to build ourselves up, we're going to lose. Well, we're not going to lose. We're going to win.